My daughter-in-law told my son that I smelled like diesel and sawdust, and that she didn't want me sitting at her mother's dining room table at Christmas. My son didn't argue with her. He just said, "I get it." And 10 minutes later, he did something that I still think about every single day. But let me back up. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years for a lumber yard outside of Sudbury, Ontario. Started as a yard hand at 19. Ended up running the whole receiving operation before I retired 2 years ago. It wasn't glamorous work. My hands are proof of that. The knuckles on my right hand never fully healed from a load binder snap in 2009, and there's a scar along my forearm from a forklift incident I don't talk about much. But that job put food on the table, put my son through college, and paid off the house on Copper Street that my late wife Irene picked out the week after we got married. She died 11 years ago. Breast cancer. I still sleep on my side of the bed. My son's name is Neil. He's 34. He works in IT for a mining company in Sudbury. Good steady job, benefits, pension. He met his wife, Gwendolyn, at a conference in Toronto about 6 years ago. She's from Oakville. Her father is a chartered accountant. Her mother teaches at a private school. They're not bad people, I want to be clear about that. They're just particular. About things. About appearances. About what a Sunday dinner is supposed to look like and who is supposed to be sitting around it. The first time I met Gwendolyn's parents, her mother looked at my jacket, a Carhartt I'd had for 15 years, still perfectly good, and smiled in that way that isn't really a smile. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I just thought, okay, that's how this is going to be. Neil and Gwendolyn got married 3 years ago. Beautiful wedding. Irene would have cried the whole way through. I held it together until they played the first dance song, which happened to be the same song Irene and I had danced to at our wedding, and then I stepped outside for a few minutes to look at the parking lot and collect myself. Nobody noticed except the bartender, who handed me a scotch when I came back in without me asking. Good man, that bartender. For the first year or so, things were fine. Neil and I talked on the phone every week. Sometimes he'd drive up on a Saturday and we'd work on the old Silverado I've been restoring in the garage. The same truck I drove the day he was born, a 91 Burgundy, bench seat, 300,000 kilometers, and still running if you knew how to coax it. It needs a lot of coaxing these days, but working on that truck with Neil was the best thing we did together. Just the two of us, radio on, grease on our hands, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. Then the visits started getting shorter, then every other week, then once a month. I told myself it was normal. He had a life. He had a wife. I remembered what it was like to be newly married and pulled in 17 directions at once. Last December, Neil called to tell me that Gwendolyn's family was hosting Christmas dinner at their house in Oakville. Her parents, her sister and brother-in-law, a few cousins. He said I was welcome to come. I asked him what time. He paused just a half second, too long before he said, "Actually, it might be a pretty full house. Gwendolyn's not sure there's room." I said, "Room at the table?" He said, "I'll check." He called back an hour later and said it was fine. There was room and he'd text me the address. I drove the 4.5 hours to Oakville on Christmas Eve. I brought a bottle of rye whiskey for Gwendolyn's father, a box of chocolates from the shop in Sudbury that Irene always liked, and a card I'd spent 45 minutes picking out at the Shoppers Drug Mart. I checked into a motel near the highway because Neil and Gwendolyn had a one-bedroom condo at the time, and I told them I didn't want to be underfoot, which was true. But it was also true that I'd noticed Gwendolyn's expression the last time I'd stayed on their pull-out couch. Christmas morning I got up early, drove to a Tim Hortons, had my coffee, and read the paper on my phone for an hour. I wasn't due at the house until 2. I had a lot of time to fill. When I got to Gwendolyn's parents' place, a big house in one of those subdivisions where all the houses look like they were designed by the same person who was trying very hard, I parked on the street and sat in my car for a minute. I'd worn my good wool sweater, the navy one. I'd shined my boots. I had the gifts in a bag from the LCBO. Gwendolyn's mother opened the door. She looked at me. She looked at my bag. She said, "Oh, you found us," in a tone that suggested this was mildly surprising. I said, "Neil's directions were good." I gave them the whiskey and the chocolates. Gwendolyn's father shook my hand and said, "Lumber, right?" I said, "Yes." He said, and walked back toward the living room. I sat in a chair near the window for most of the afternoon. Neil checked on me a couple of times. We talked about the Silverado. He said he wanted to come up in February and work on the carburetor. I said I'd have it ready for him. Dinner was fine. The food was good. Gwendolyn is a genuinely excellent cook. I'll always say that. But I was seated at the far end of the table, between one of the cousins who was on his phone the whole time, and an empty chair where someone had apparently decided not to come at the last minute. I ate my turkey and drank my 1 glass of wine and watched Neil across the table, laughing at something his brother-in-law said, and I thought about Irene, and how Christmas at our house used to go, and how she used to make me put on a paper crown from the cracker, even though I always said I looked ridiculous, and I kept my face steady and I finished my dinner. I left by 8, said I had a long drive. Neil walked me to the door and hugged me and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." I told him I was proud of him. That's always true. I drove back to Sudbury that night because I didn't want to sleep in that motel by myself on Christmas night. I didn't say anything to Neil about how that Christmas felt. I figured it was their life, their family, their traditions. I'm not a man who makes demands. But then February happened. Neil was supposed to come up for the weekend to work on the truck. Thursday night he called to say Gwendolyn had a work thing, a team event, and she needed the car. I said, "Take the train, I'll pick you up at the station." There was a pause. He said he'd see if he could make it work. He didn't come. March, same thing. April he came up for one day, a Sunday, and Gwendolyn called twice while we were in the garage. He left after lunch. In May, he told me they were going to Gwendolyn's parents' place for the long weekend. I said, "Have a good time." He said, "You could come." I said, "I think that's okay, you go." I want to be honest here. I was hurt. Not angry. I don't think anger was the right word for it. More like something quiet and settling, like when the temperature drops and you can feel it before you can see it. I started filling my weekends differently. More time in the garage. More walks by the river. I started volunteering at the food bank on Saturday mornings, which Irene always said I should do, and she was right. I should have done it years ago. I didn't talk to anyone about how things were with Neil. I'm not built that way. I'm from a generation of men who work the problem quietly or put it in a box and keep moving. Then came August long weekend. Neil called on a Thursday to say they were having a small gathering. Some of Gwendolyn's colleagues and a couple of their friends, a backyard barbecue thing at their new house. They'd moved into a house in the east end of Sudbury a few months earlier. He said I should come. I said, "What time?" He said, "Around 4. I said I'd be there. I showed up at 4 with a case of Sleeman's and a bag of pea-meal bacon from the butcher on Larch Street. The good stuff, thick cut, the kind you can only get locally. I rang the doorbell. Gwendolyn answered. She looked at the pea-meal bacon. She said, "Oh, we weren't sure you were coming." I said, "Neil invited me Thursday." She said, "Right, of course," and held the door open. There were maybe 14-15 people in the backyard. I didn't know any of them. Neil came over, shook my hand, which isn't how we'd ever greeted each other, and introduced me to a couple of people. Then someone called him over to the other side of the yard, and he went. I stood near the cooler and talked to a man named, I don't remember, actually. I think it was something like Connell or Connors, who worked with Gwendolyn. He was pleasant enough. We talked about the Leafs. We talked about the price of gas. After a while, he drifted away, and I was just standing there with my beer watching my son stand across the yard. At some point, I went to put more ice in the cooler, and I heard Gwendolyn talking to one of her friends near the back fence. I wasn't trying to listen. But our yard isn't big, she said. He just showed up smelling like he'd been in that garage all week. I keep telling Neil, your dad needs to understand this isn't Sudbury. Her friend said something I didn't catch. Gwendolyn said, he doesn't fit. And honestly, my mother hasn't forgotten the Christmas thing. I don't know what the Christmas thing was. I still don't know what I did at Christmas. I stood there with a bag of ice in my hands, and I thought about Irene, and about the Silverado in my garage, and about 31 years of getting up before sunrise and coming home after dark so that Neil could go to university and have a life that fit. I thought about the paper crown I used to wear because she asked me to. I put the ice in the cooler. I went back to standing where I'd been standing. Neil came over a little while later. He looked at my face and he said, "You doing okay?" I said, "I'm good." He nodded. Then he said, quiet, not looking at me, "Gwendolyn's parents are coming next month? Labor Day. I'm not sure there's going to be." He stopped. He said, "I just wanted to give you a heads up." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Heads up about what, Neil?" He didn't answer. He looked at the fence. I said, "I'm going to go home." He started to say something, and I put my hand on his shoulder briefly and I said, "I'm not angry. I'm just going to head out." And I left. I walked around the side of the house so I didn't have to go back through the yard, and I drove home. That night I sat in the garage for a long time. I didn't turn on the radio. I just sat on the stool next to the Silverado and thought. I thought about a lot of things. About what it means to grow old and become invisible. About how a man can spend his whole life building something, and then one day look up and find that what he built has moved to the other side of the yard. About whether I'd done something wrong, or whether some things just happen this way. I didn't cry. I'm not saying that as a point of pride. I've cried plenty in my life. I cried at Irene's funeral until I couldn't breathe. I just didn't cry that night. I was past the crying part. I was in the part that comes after. I went inside and I called my brother. He lives in Timmins. His name is Wallace, and he's 2 years older than me, and he's been my best friend since we were boys fishing off the dock at our uncle's place in Chapleau. I told him what had happened. Not everything, but enough. Wallace said, "Come up for Labor Day." I said, "I can't leave, Neil might." Wallace said, "He's not coming and you know that. Come up." I said I'd think about it. A week later, Neil called. He said Labor Day was going to be busy with Gwendolyn's family. He was sorry. He hoped I understood. He said maybe the following weekend. I said, sure. I called Wallace back and said I was coming to Timmins for Labor Day. But here's what happened in between, and this is the part I want to tell you. The Friday before Labor Day, I was in the garage working on the Silverado's carburetor, finally getting to it on my own, when Neil's car pulled into the driveway. It was late afternoon, maybe 5 o'clock. I heard the car door, and then I heard footsteps, and then Neil was standing in the garage door. I said, I thought you had family coming. He said, they come tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the truck. Then he walked over and picked up a socket wrench and crouched down and looked at what I was working on without saying anything. We worked for about an hour without talking much. I handed him things. He handed things back. The radio was on, CBC, the afternoon program, someone talking about something in Ottawa. Neither of us was listening to it. Then Neil set down the wrench and said, I heard what she said, at the barbecue, about the garage. I didn't say anything, he said. I should have said something then. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. I said, Neil, he said, no, let me say this. He was looking at the truck, not at me. I've been trying so hard to, I don't know, fit into her family, into the Oakville thing, into all of it. And I think I've been, he stopped. I think I've been disappearing you, to make that easier. Disappearing. I don't know where he got it, but that was exactly what it had felt like. To be slowly disappeared. I said, you've got a wife. You've got a life. That's what I raised you for. He said, you raised me to know the difference between right and not right. We were both quiet for a minute. He said, I'm not going to their Labor Day thing. I said, Neil, don't blow up your marriage over. He said, I'm not blowing anything up. I just decided I'd rather be here. He looked at me then, finally. If that's okay, I said, go call your wife. He went inside and called Gwendolyn. I don't know what he said. I stayed in the garage and I tightened the carburetor bolts, and I thought about Irene and how she always said Neil had his father's stubbornness, and she always said it like it was a problem, but she was smiling when she said it. Neil came back out after 20 minutes. He picked up the wrench. I said, everything okay? He said, she's not happy. I said, that's fair. He said, she'll be okay. I said, what did you tell her? He said, I told her my dad needed help with the carburetor. I laughed. First real laugh I'd had in a while. He laughed too. And then we worked until it was too dark to see properly, and I went inside and made eggs and toast, and we ate standing at the kitchen counter like we used to do when he was 17, and we didn't talk about Gwendolyn or her family or Oakville or any of it. We just ate our eggs. The next morning, Neil's phone rang about 9 times between 6 and 8 in the morning. I made him coffee. He drank it and looked out the kitchen window at the garage. Eventually, he answered one of the calls and went into the other room. After that, things didn't magically become simple. I want to be clear about that because life isn't a television program. Gwendolyn and I have not had a warm relationship. There's been some honest conversation since then. Neil made sure of that, I think, and Gwendolyn apologized to me in a way that was a little stiff, but it was genuine, I believe. Her mother I see maybe twice a year at holidays, and we are polite to each other, and that's probably the best it's going to be. But Neil comes up most Saturdays now, sometimes for the whole weekend. The Silverado runs again, properly runs. You should hear her on a cold morning, just a clean idle 63 years old, and she still turns heads at the station. We drove it to Wallace's place in Timmins in October. 3 hours with the windows down and the radio on, and my son in the passenger seat, same as when he was 8 years old and Irene was following behind us in the family car, shaking her head and laughing. I think about what Gwendolyn said at that barbecue sometimes, that I smelled like the garage, that I didn't fit. She wasn't wrong, exactly. I have spent a lot of time in garages. I smell like oil and sawdust in the particular cold of a northern Ontario winter and 31 years of honest work. That smell is in the Silverado's bench seat, in the jacket I wore to that Christmas dinner, in the walls of the house on Copper Street that Irene picked out. You don't get to be 63 without accumulating a smell. It's the smell of a life. I've stopped apologizing for it. What I know is this: the man who raised Neil didn't raise him to disappear his father to make a dinner table more comfortable. And Neil, eventually, remembered that. That's not nothing. In fact, if you want my honest opinion, that's just about everything. Irene would have said I'm being dramatic. She would have handed me a paper crown and told me to sit down and eat my turkey. She would have been right. She usually was.